Facts that sound completely fake. Troy. One of the most highly debated topics in all of classical scholarship for some 2,000 years was whether or not there had ever been a city called Troy. The Iliad of Homer described it in great detail, a powerful fortified city on the coast of what is now northwestern Turkey, which was besieged by a Greek army for 10 years and finally destroyed by a combination of military tactics and a wooden horse filled with soldiers. The story was so particular, so architecturally detailed, so geographically grounded that it demanded a response from anyone who took it seriously. Either Troy was real, or Homer was the greatest fiction writer of the ancient world. For most of the intellectual history we have records of, the verdict has been decidedly in favor of fiction. The story was too melodramatic. The scale was too big. The wooden horse was altogether too theatrical. Serious students of the classics thought the Iliad was great literature and little else. It wasn't considered serious archaeology to treat it as a historical document, to go to northwestern Turkey and seek a buried city. It was the performance of one who had confused poetry with geography. Heinrich Schliemann had not been mistaken. He was a German businessman with no formal archaeological training, an obsessive belief that Homer was describing a real place, and enough personal wealth to act on that belief without waiting for institutional permission. In 1868, he went to northwestern Turkey and, based on his reading of the geographical descriptions in the Iliad, found a hill named Hisarlik and began to dig. But what he discovered beneath that hill was not a city. There were 9 of them, built one on top of the other over thousands of years of continuous occupation. The layer, now identified as Troy 6 or Troy 7a, dating from about 1300 to 1180 BCE, had massive defensive walls, violent destruction, and a location that matched the descriptions of Homer with a precision no one expected. This was a real city. It had walls. It had been set on fire. It was sitting right where the poetry said it would be. The archaeological establishment resisted the implications for years. By today's standards, Schliemann's methods were destructive and his interpretations sometimes flawed, but the city itself was not to blame. Subsequent excavations, carried out according to the proper methodology, confirmed the major finding. Troy was real. Homer describes it, and it was destroyed in that period. It is still debated whether the specific events of the Iliad took place there, but the setting was not invented, because one non-credentialed person decided to take the text seriously enough to check. 2,000 years of scholarly consensus that Homer was writing pure fiction fell apart. The story had been kept alive in poetry for 20 centuries. The city had been lying under the ground all this time, waiting for someone to believe it was really there. The Dancing Plague. It was July 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, in what today is northeastern France. A woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and started to dance. There was no music, there was no celebration, no reason at all. She just started to move and kept on going. She had attracted about 30 people by the end of the first week. By the close of the second week, it was over 100. At the height of the outbreak, historians believe somewhere between 400 and 450 people were dancing at the same time in the streets of Strasbourg, some of them continuously without meaningful rest for days at a time. A lot died. Causes listed were heart failure, stroke, and exhaustion. The city fathers were at a loss as to what to do. The first reaction was to hire musicians and build a stage, on the theory that if people were going to dance uncontrollably, it was best to give them a proper venue and let the episode play itself out. This didn't work. The dancing continued and the death toll mounted. The doctors were consulted at last. They decided that the sufferers had too much blood and that the cure was to dance more, in the hope that the surplus heat would, in the end, burn itself out. This didn't help either. This event is historically significant, not only because it is strange, which it is, but also because it was recorded in unusual detail for the time. There are doctor's notes. There are minutes of the city council. There are modern records of several independent witnesses. This is not a myth or a legend passed down from generation to generation by oral tradition. It is a bureaucratically recorded public health crisis of the 16th century in which hundreds of people danced themselves to death on the streets of a major European city, while the authorities sought to control it by means of stage construction and medical counsel about hot blood. Modern scholars have proposed a number of explanations. The most discussed is ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain and contains compounds that are chemically similar to LSD. If eaten in large enough quantities, it can cause convulsions and involuntary movement. Another theory is mass psychogenic illness, a well-documented phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms in a group that does not have an underlying organic cause. The third relates to the specific religious and cultural fears of the era, including a general fear of a certain saint who was believed to curse the sinful with dancing beyond their control. There is no consensus on any of these explanations. Each one explains some part of the event, not other part. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is one of the best documented and least satisfactorily explained events in European history. Historians agree it did. No one agrees on why, and the official records of the city of Strasbourg that summer describe it with the same administrative matter-of-factness with which they described road repairs and tax collection, as if the fact that several hundred people danced themselves to death in the street was unusual, but not, in the context of running a medieval city, entirely surprising. The Viking Sunstone. In some of the medieval Icelandic texts written at some point around the 13th century, there is a description of a navigational instrument used by Viking sailors that reads, "Depending on your willingness to take it seriously, either as a straightforward account of a real instrument or as the kind of detail that gets quietly filed under poetic embellishment and moved past." The texts describe a crystal called a solarstein, which translates literally as sunstone, that could be held up to the sky on a cloudy day to find the precise position of the sun even when it was completely obscured by cloud cover. A sailor could determine direction with reasonable accuracy if he could see the sun through a solid cloud. He was a sailor who could not navigate by memory and guesswork over open ocean. There was one simple reason why the idea that the Vikings had a crystal that could tell them where the sun was, even if it was behind the clouds, was not taken seriously by mainstream historians. It sounded like something medieval writers would tack on to make their subjects seem more impressive. A common characteristic of heroic literature was extraordinary navigational ability. The use of magical instruments to extend human perception beyond the natural limits was a standard narrative device. The sunstone fit nicely into both categories and uncomfortably into the category of real technology physical. Then the physicists came in. The debate was entirely reframed by a discovery made by researchers studying the optical properties of naturally occurring crystals, and in particular a mineral called Icelandspar, a transparent variety of the mineral calcite found throughout Scandinavia. Icelandspar has a property called birefringence, which means that it splits light into two beams as light passes through it. When you rotate a piece of Icelandspar while looking through it at the sky, the two beams it produces become equally bright at a specific angle that corresponds precisely to the direction of the sun, whether the sun is visible or not. On a completely overcast day, when no other aid to navigation is available, a Viking sailor could find the sun to within a few degrees of accuracy by slowly rotating a piece of Icelandspar. The physics was present. The question is whether it was actually used by the Vikings. That question received a big answer in 2013. Among the navigational instruments recovered from the debris of the Alderney, a 16th century British warship that sank in 1592, researchers found a piece of Icelandspar. It sat next to a pair of navigational dividers and a sundial, right where a navigator would keep his tools. The crystal served a purpose. It wasn't cargo. Someone who used it often and placed it in exactly the right place for a working instrument. A medieval account speaks of a navigational crystal that could assist sailors in locating the sun through clouds. Physicists have shown that such a crystal exists and works just as described. One was discovered by archaeologists on a ship, kept with other navigational instruments and in active use. The sunstone had gone from a poetic flourish no serious historian ever believed to a confirmed piece of technology that Viking and later European navigators were actually carrying. Those who used it knew exactly what it did. When historians centuries later read of it, they decided it was too extraordinary to be taken literally. The crystal didn't care one way or the other. The City of Ubar. There are references in various ancient texts from various civilizations and various centuries to a city in the Arabian Peninsula so rich, so architecturally stunning, and so utterly lost that subsequent generations decided it had never existed at all. The Greeks of old named it Iram. Pre-Islamic Arabian poetry refers to it as a place of tall pillars and unimaginable abundance. It is referred to by name in the Quran as a city of great power destroyed by divine punishment and swallowed by the desert as a result of the arrogance of its inhabitants. Traders and travelers had mentioned it in passing over the centuries. A place that once existed somewhere in the vast empty interior of what is now Oman and Yemen, in a region of desert so inhospitable and so poorly mapped that the idea of a major city thriving there seemed ever more difficult to credit. By the 20th century, scholarly consensus had comfortably settled into myth. The city had too many names, in too many ways. The descriptions were too individual. The desert in which it was supposed to be was too empty and too hostile. The claim was in the same league as Atlantis, a city of pillars and abundance in the middle of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the largest continuous sand deserts on Earth. Interesting as a cultural artifact, not worth considering seriously as geography. And then in 1984, a filmmaker and amateur archaeologist named Nicholas Clapp read a book by a British explorer named Bertram Thomas who had crossed the empty quarter in 1930 and saw something that had been in his notes without much attention. His expedition was guided by Bedouin guides who had pointed out an ancient road running under the sand and named it the Road to Ubar. Clapp was sufficiently concerned by the detail to contact NASA. What followed was one of the more surprising collaborations in the history of archaeological discovery. While at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Clapp was able to obtain radar imaging data collected by the Space Shuttle Challenger on a mission in 1984. Radar imaging penetrates surface sand and reveals what is underneath. Underneath the surface of the empty quarter, it revealed faint but distinct traces of ancient caravan routes converging from various directions to a single point in the desert in what is now southern Oman. Many ancient roads, each invisible from the ground, each buried under centuries of sand, all leading to one place. In 1992, Clapp directed an excavation at the site. They discovered the remnants of a fortified settlement with towers and walls covered by the sand, surrounded by traces of long-term habitation and large-scale commercial activity. In the middle of the site, the ground had fallen into a huge sinkhole, the result of the limestone caverns beneath the settlement collapsing, probably suddenly, dropping the city into the earth. It was a geological destruction, not a divine one, but it was catastrophic, and it was final. The city, referenced by multiple ancient cultures, dismissed as mythology by 20th century scholars, located by satellite imaging from space, and confirmed by excavation on the ground, had been under the sand the entire time. Geographically, the old books that described it had been right, but the old roads that led to it had been real. All the things that had made it sound like a legend had turned out to be history, and the only thing that had kept it hidden was several centuries of accumulated sand and a widespread assumption that extraordinary claims about the ancient world were probably not worth the effort of checking. The rocks that walk alone. In the northwest corner of Death Valley in California lies a dry lake bed known as the Racecourse Playa. It is one of the flattest surfaces on Earth, about 5 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide, and almost perfectly level over its entire area. The surface is cracked dry mud that bakes hard in the desert heat and remains so for most of the year. It is a totally unremarkable piece of desert geology by any physical measure. Only there are rocks making up its entire surface. Hundreds of them, from the size of small stones to boulders of several hundred kilograms. And behind every rock, a track, clearly visible in the dried mud, a long, shallow groove running across the surface for meters, sometimes for hundreds of meters, curving and turning and sometimes crossing other tracks, before ending up right where the rock is now. The rocks had shifted, and they had done it without water, without an obvious means of propulsion, without anyone to give them a nudge. Rocks weighing as much as 300 kilograms had moved across a flat, dry lake bed, leaving behind a precise record of their journey in the muck below. The phenomenon was first noticed by geologists in the 1940s. For the next 70 years, the moving rocks of Racecourse Playa would be among the most studied and least understood geological mysteries in the United States. Researchers have proposed theories including dust devils, wind alone, algae that make the surface slippery, and ice sheets that form underneath the rocks, reducing friction enough for wind to push them. All the theories explain some observations, but could not explain some others. No one had ever seen a rock move before. The tracks were only ever found afterwards, proof of something that seemed to happen when no one was looking. In 2014, however, a team of researchers from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography settled the question with a combination of GPS trackers attached to the rocks and time-lapse cameras placed around the playa. What they recorded was a series of conditions so specific that it had never been directly observed in over 70 years of investigation. In winter, thin sheets of ice formed on the lake bed overnight. By morning, the temperatures had risen a little, and the ice began to melt and break into large floating panels. Gradually, the wind traveling across the surface pushed those ice panels over the mud. The panels shoved the rocks in front of them, moving them at speed so slow as to be totally imperceptible without instruments, but fast enough to cover significant distance over the course of an afternoon. As the water drained and the surface dried up, the rocks moved, pushed along a thin film of meltwater by floating ice, leaving tracks in the mud below. The process required a precise combination of rain, freezing temperatures, morning sun, and specific wind conditions that all had to occur in just the right sequence. That sequence was so rare, it had not been observed in 7 decades of scientific observation. The rocks moved across the playa over thousands of years, leaving trails everyone could see and no one could explain. It was nothing unusual. There was no mysterious shifting of the rocks. They moved with perfect logical physicalness. All that had been missing for 70 years was someone there at the right moment to see. So, all the cases in this documentary unfold in the same way. Something real occurred, someone got it right, and then literate people who saw that record decided it was too weird to be serious. Troy was there. The dancing plague was recorded. The Sunstone was working. Ubar lay beneath the sand. The rocks were shifting every winter. The problem was never the evidence. The trouble was always the same. Reality was much stranger than the people studying it were ready to believe, and it kept proving to be right anyway.